Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? I think I can hear myself, so it sounds pretty good. I am going to start before I even forget, because I was reminded. Please, for those of you who have cell phones, which might be all of us, remember if you can turn those off, that would be fantastic. But just to go ahead and get us started, first of all, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, once again. I am so pleased to welcome you here to the third and final segment of the Founding Fathers Legacy Series, Unpacking the Complex Truth. I am Hillary Carter-West, and I am the Vice Regent for the District of Columbia of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. For those of you who may not know, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association is an all-women's group which in 1853 came together to rescue this historic estate, and now, for over 160 years, has independently owned and operated Mount Vernon, pursuing our mission of preservation and educating the world about the life, leadership, and legacy of our nation's first president. On behalf of our regent and the 22 vice regents who I serve with, I want to welcome you all to Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington, for what should be an informative and educational afternoon for everyone. Today's event is presented in partnership with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, which is headed by esteemed former DC Mayor Sharon Pratt. The Institute was founded to encourage constructive and spirited dialogue around important issues of the day, and illuminating these conversations with insights from the city of Washington and our nation's history. I am thrilled that Mount Vernon is partnering with the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, and to have all of you here today, both in person and online, to participate in this exciting conversation. The Founding Fathers Legacy Series focuses on the three of our early presidents who were each pivotal in establishing our nation's capital along the banks of the Potomac River: James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. As we better understand the founding of the city of Washington, D.C. by these men, while exploring their lives, motivations, as well as contradictions, we will hopefully better comprehend the promises of the American experience, as well as the challenges that remain in order for us to achieve that more perfect union. This important series, as the title states, was designed to unpack the complex truth, examining the education, philosophical influences, personal experiences, families, and the economic influences on these three founding fathers. And today's segment will focus on George Washington. Outstanding events have taken place already at James Madison's Montpelier and Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. Those discussions were both moving and illuminating, and I am so delighted that we are here today at Mount Vernon. So with that, let us go ahead and get today's discussion started, and I'm going to ask each of our panelists to go ahead and come up and take their places. So thank you all.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good? All right, I just make sure. Well, it is a real pleasure to meet with all of you and to welcome all of you. It is a real pleasure for me to partnership with former mayor, have the experience of the wonderful work of CEO. I am the former Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Maryland. I said former. Also political analyst and very, very proud to serve. And Christ called me up and says, I have this idea that I think is great for you. And that is to serve as co-chair of Unpacking, along with your buddy, Rick Evans here, Roberts is co-chair of and to have all of you here with us is part of this incredible series, which really sort of connects us in a way, in a new way, actually, to see and learn and put in perspective of the men who founded the nation, but in a very particular way, Washington, D.C., the district, our backyard. Really have an opportunity to kind of delve into what that means. And as I said, the leading energy and the star power behind this is none other than Sharon Pratt, the esteemed former mayor of D.C., founding director of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History, and wanting to make that connection and that bridge for the citizens of the District of Columbia, but more importantly, the country, and connect, especially in a special way, this generation with a very important history. Also, I'm excited about this convening, just beyond Independence Day, to discuss where we go from here. How does this look, particularly as we're now getting ourselves all ready and psyched for an upcoming presidential election? Yay! You feel it, right? Just shut the shutters and turn off the lights. But no, it's important for us to sort of contextualize this civic moment that we have and the responsibilities we have in this moment, with the obligations that were handed to us by the founders in the founding documents, the Constitution, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, right? That effort is on us. And so our discussions at Montpelier and Monticello and now here at Mount Vernon is in that vein of we the people, and our efforts to strive to form this more perfect union. And so we are very fortunate to have with us in the conversation regarding that effort an esteemed panel of experts to help us determine how to apply the aspirations of George Washington to further evolve the country. And it's complicated, folks. We know that. The man owned slaves, right? It's complicated to sign off on a document that talk about freedom. And it's important that we not get lost in the complication, but understand it. And our panel is here today to help us do this. So it's a real pleasure to begin with an introduction of Dr. Patrick Sparrow, who is a new executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. Doesn't look like a library, but okay. We'll go with that. He's a respected author, including his work of Frontier Rebels, and our host today. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thrilled and honored to have you here.
No, real pleasure. We were catching up a little bit before the conversation. Real cool guy, so you should talk to him. Miss Brenda Parker, educator and former Mount Vernon historical interpreter. Yes. Thank you so much for being here and having the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Excited. Mr. Fergus Borderwick. I knew I was going to blow that. I had some water before it. I thought I'd work it through, but the renowned historian, amongst his many distinguished works, authored Washington, The Making of the American Capital. It's always a pleasure. And when we're doing the tours, what's the best part? what the docents are telling you is really cool, but his questions really gets you to the next level, and I really appreciate that so much. Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who has been with us before, so good to have you back. Presidential historian, author of The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. We're excited about that, and you've got the book coming out in a couple of weeks.
Well,
You're
due in
not
a couple of weeks.
due in a couple of weeks. I'm rushing the process. Book is out. Buy it. And Judge Quander, whom we all know, admire, and respect. Such a real pleasure to have the judge with us. Historian, the D.C. Mayor's agent for historic preservation, and author of The Quanders since 1684. An enduring African American legacy. Yes, indeed it is. Such a real pleasure to have you. These are the smart folks that are going to get us through the conversation. So, Madam Mayor, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us going.
Okay, thank you, Michael. You referred to them as the smart folks, so.
It was implied.
Thank you, Michael. We are really thrilled and honored. Michael does such a terrific job of helping us to providing leadership along with Karen Tramontano with our senior advisory committee. We have a great team. We have Dean April Massey, who's with us from that senior advisory committee, and the indomitable Carol Fulp, without whom none of these symposiums could happen. So we're very grateful to you. We're also delighted and honored to be here with a partnership with the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon. They've been spectacular. And Hillary, who I think of almost like as a niece, but she's a vice regent, right? Am I supposed to salute? And Gail West, who is a former member, but emeritus, are you not, Gail, of the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon. And Bradburn, Doug Bradburn is the one who got us started as well in our early conversations, who is the CEO and president. Michael has introduced Patrick Spiro, who is now the head of the library here at Mount Vernon. The person without whom we could not function at all, Stephen McLeod. He is Stephen is spectacular. Carol tells me all of the people that I may not remember. Also, we want to, obviously, UDC Board of Trustees, Kellogg Foundation. We'll hear later from Angie Gates, who is with Events DC, that promotes the life and spirit in the many corridors of Washington, D.C., which is what this program is about. And I think that I've covered the waterfront. Carol? So why are we here? What is this program about? The Ladies Association of Mount Vernon and IPPH putting together this program today about the Founding Fathers Legacy Series. Well, what we talk about, and I think Maria Bunch and others have listened to many of these conversations, is that these are the three founding fathers, Madison, Jefferson, Washington, who were pivotal to establishing the capital in the South, along the banks of the Potomac. Now, I do remember my years with the National Party. I'd get up and I'd say, I'm from D.C., and they say, oh, good, it's good to have somebody from Tennessee. I said, no. No, I have that kind of accent, but it's D.C. We brought it here, and they played such a pivotal role to establishing this great city of Washington, D.C. And what we do with the Founding Fathers Legacy Series is to examine these men, to honor them, to celebrate them, but also to examine them in terms of their childhood, their education, their family influences, their philosophies, but also the economic pressures upon them as planters here in the state of Virginia. And we do know that economic pressure of as planters had everything to do also with the tensions that the country experienced about the location of the Capitol. It was only when I read Ferguson's book that I understood America almost fell apart over deciding the location of the Capitol and what was the undercurrent of that dynamic and of that tension, not exclusively, but very significantly around continuing the practice of the institution of slavery. And unfortunately, that was the deciding factor of why indeed we ended up with the Capitol here. These were extraordinary men, though. Extraordinary men. James Madison was a brilliant man who was the principal author of the United States Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, he was the Renaissance man in every sense of the word. And he is the man who authored the language that inspires people to this day. When Abraham Lincoln was in the midst of a civil war, what document did he turn to? The Declaration of Independence, because he knew that was the document that would keep us together. It is so hopeful, it's so uplifting. And George Washington, you have to admire George Washington. He's a man that managed to put together a ragtag group of volunteers who had no training, limited discipline, and in many instances, not even shoes. And they had to deal with cannon fire and a disciplined, formidable Navy, and he pulled it off. He won. And he is also the person who had the drive and determination that this, and it's my home, but it was originally, they say, a swamp. It was nothing really in the way of a real presence. And it has been transformed into one of the most majestic, beautiful cities in the world. That was his drive, George Washington's drive. And yet at the same time, these three extraordinary human beings were the instrument of a malignancy that still threatens the body politic of our country today. Because even though finally we had the 13th Amendment and ended slavery, and we had a few moments of affirmative action, unfortunately, that racial hierarchy, that caste system remains with us today. And so that is the contradiction. But we who are members and part of this series offer this series with great hope, because we know about that extraordinary experience that allowed us to beat the most formidable Navy in the world. We know that we had the capacity to produce this extraordinary city that is one of the great capitals of the world. We know that we have always, in the toughest of times, found a way to come together and to achieve is what they promised and what we all believe in, that more perfect union. That's what the series is about. That's what we're hopeful of, and that we see ourselves as that great American family, that family of America. And that's what we are determined that we will, honor and celebrate today. So I'm thrilled that all of you are participating in our audience, thrilled to be on this program with these extraordinary scholars, individuals who can contribute. And with that, we'll let it roll. Oh, that's right. And, to establish the predicate of all of this and put it in context, we have Fergus Bodwick, who's going to help us, establish the parameters of this conversation.
Thanks, Sharon. This is a really, really quick George Washington and the creation of Washington, D.C. 101 tutorial here. But first, thank you, Michael, Sharon, Mount Vernon, for making this today's symposium possible, and also for the previous two, for this culmination of an excellent, really excellent series of programs on the presidents at their homes. The first two are available online.
Yep.
This one will be too. So if you're not out for a couple of minutes, you can get it online fairly soon. Okay, so to begin, well, why are we all sitting here and not somewhere else? We could be sitting in what's today the South Bronx in New York. We could be sitting in Princeton, New Jersey, or Annapolis, or Germantown, Pennsylvania, all of which, along with some 27 or 28 other locations were proposed as the site of the national capital. But we're here, or at least down the river from the District of Columbia. And the reason ultimately we are here and not someplace else is thanks to George Washington. Okay, I don't want to oversimplify the political combat that took place, and there was a lot. The verbal push and pull and thrashing over the possible site of a national capital. And more than once, that controversy nearly crippled the first Congress. First Congress, by the way, was taking place in New York City, then our capital, 1789, in 1789 to 91, then it moves to Philadelphia for the rest of the 1790s. But at any rate, so what I'm talking about here is taking place in New York City. And when I mentioned the South Bronx, one of the proposed sites, I will say as a New Yorker and a bit of a chauvinist, it would have been nice, but was the tip of the South Bronx. Anyway, our government, our fragile new government, just about cracked apart over this and other controversial issues that were entangled in a rat's nest of conflict, political conflict. And if anyone has the notion that the early years of Congress and the United States were kind of quiet and driven by consensus and everybody just got along fine and a lot of bear hugs and that sort of, erase it. It was as contentious as Congress today and as government was today. And it was, as I said, this was trench warfare, 18th century style. But at any rate, what was at the nub of the controversy? It had different parts to it, but as has already been mentioned, right at the root was this phenomenon of slavery, of American slavery. There were far fewer enslaved people in the 1780s, 1790s, fewer than 1 million. There would be 4 million by the time of the Civil War, as we know, fewer than 1 million. But it was so deeply entrenched. Every state was a slave state, by the way, except for Massachusetts. Massachusetts, which was sort of pretty much a non-slave state, although we won't get deep in the weeds on that. But every other state knew the number of slaves was increasing in New York in the 1790s, not decreasing. New Jersey had enslaved people, a few, until 1864. Okay, so if you think slavery wasn't a national phenomenon, think again. However, it was the basis of the economy in southern states. And it was made clear, I don't have time to quote as I would like to, more than one member of Congress from a southern slavery-based state saying, we will, if slavery is not protected, we will not remain in this union. Exactly the same threats that would be made later in the 19th century and on the eve of the Civil War are being made in 1789 and 1790 in order to protect slavery against the fear that a national capital in the North, Philadelphia would have been the most likely location, that a capital in the North in a state that was in the process of ending slavery would set freedom as the national standard. It is impossible, at least for me, to imagine, and I think for most historians to imagine, that had the capital been placed in a northern state, that Southerners, slave-owning Southerners, would have succeeded in maintaining their hammerlock on the national government as they did up to the Civil War. So this was an imperative for Southerners. Let's cut to the chase here, or else I'll be here all afternoon. Finally, a deal was cut. Many, or perhaps all of you, have seen Hamilton. You know the deal in the room, you know the room where it happened. There was a real deal, and there was a real room. It was in Thomas Jefferson's rented residence in New York City. And essentially, Alexander Hamilton, who was an emancipationist, I'm not going to say abolitionist because the terms didn't really apply in the 1700s, who wanted a northern capital very much and was a member of the New York Manumission Society, but desperately needed support to enact a huge and complicated financial plan that would stabilize the finances of the United States, finally was willing to cut a deal with members from the South, brokered by Madison, Jefferson, and a few others, to trade the votes of his northern friends to support a southern capital in a slave state in return for several Potomac Valley congressmen trading their votes for his financial plan to stabilize the country. This was the kind of bargain that politics is made of. You know, politics is not a business for moral purists. But
We try. I mean,
my point is just to underscore again, politics was then and has often been brutal. Principled people making compromises they didn't want to make. Anyway, it had been so controversial just to achieve the idea of a southern capital, safely embedded between the states of Virginia and Maryland. But where? The only person members of Congress trusted to actually select a location was George Washington, who was the great, not just a man, and a guy with the usual array of virtues and flaws of most human beings, but a transcendent symbol of the country's unity in a country that had very little sense of unity. Americans didn't all think of themselves as one people. I mean, even that fraction of white people who could vote. Most couldn't. Anyway, and bear in mind, when I say this was this was a fraught time, that the constitutional system was Plan B. That wasn't Plan A. Plan A was the Articles of Confederation of the 1780s, which flopped. It failed. It was a dud. It didn't work.
Right.
The constitutional system was essentially a fallback, second best. There was no Plan C. It was either make this work or nothing works. And we go back to being 13 little statelets that don't know whether they belong together or not. So that's what's on the table here. Anyway, so what does Washington do? Here is George Washington. Picture him on the veranda of his house, right behind us here. I guess it's behind us up there, and looking out, figuratively stroking his chin. I don't know whether he did, and looking up the Potomac River, this spectacular panorama which we still have today. Thank you to those who've preserved it over generations. And he sees the Potomac as the great highway into the heart of the North American continent, the great commercial highway. Two, well, it would suit his colleagues, friends, fellow property owners in the Potomac Valley to have a capital right next door, which would increase the property value, it's true, of his property and his friends and allies by multiples. Okay, he could have picked any place on the Potomac. That was what Congress mandated. Anywhere for 100 miles north of here, he picked next door. Okay, I think we appreciate this after 200 years, but there were factors that went into it other than, gee, it was sort of in between the North and the South. You can kind of erase that too. Anyway, so I've said a few words about the politics of slavery and the siting of the Capitol. I don't think it's news, perhaps today, that enslaved people also built Washington, D.C. Yeah. Who do you think was erecting the buildings, cutting the marble, sawing the lumber, the lumber, doing the heavy work and most of the skilled labor that erected the United States Capitol, the White House. It was called the President's Mansion at the time. Enslaved people, hundreds of them. Nearly all of them, nearly all rented, because enslaved people were tools, essentially. You could rent enslaved people, rented from property owners in Maryland and Virginia with an excess number of slaves. By the way, I recommend anybody who has the inclination, in the National Archives, there are boxes of the pay receipts for all these enslaved people. I don't mean to imply that the enslaved people were paid. Their masters were paid, their owners, their enslavers were paid. And those receipts are there. There are boxes and boxes of them. If you want to know who the people were, their names are there. Their names are there. And these things are there to be seen. And I hope something more will be done curatorially with that material someday. So slavery was at the center of the decision to put the capital where it is, and it was at the center of the creation of a city as well. And when we talk about the building of Washington, we are talking not only about the lofty political aspirations and the creation of the symbolism of the national capital, but we're talking about the ordinary people, nearly all men, a couple of women, two I was able to identify. There were probably others who were involved in this work. And as I said earlier today in an interview that we did, you know, we live among the ghosts, and I don't mean in a spooky sense, but in a kind of historical sense. We live among the ghosts of all these people. Yes, George Washington, for whom I have, by the way, great admiration. The more I've written about him, the more I've admired him, and the more I've understood how complex a man he was, and how, with respect to slavery, I should say in passing, how extraordinarily far he evolved, given the possibilities of a person from his class in his time. Remarkably so. He didn't have to. He didn't have to evolve. He could have been, dare I say, a John C. Calhoun. He wasn't. It was something very different. So just to wrap up, I think, you know, what does all this mean today? You know, besides we have a really nice city over here with some beautiful buildings.
It is nice.
Yeah. But that you know, it means that we need to understand history in all its complexity. We need to understand Washington in his complexity, the contradictions, at least to us, contradictions that informed his life and his family and the decisions he made. And we don't need fantasies and mythologies that many of us, at least in my generation, typically were fed in school. We don't need that anymore. We don't need that as a country. I mean, there is no reason we can't look clearly and coldly and with admiration and with embarrassment and sometimes shame at the complex and contradictory history of this country and the people who shaped it. And I mean, to me, as an historian, the more complexity we see, the better. The more we're able to deal with those contributions, the better we're able to deal with those of our own time. And I think it's time to toss the mythology. You know, it does not serve us, did not serve us well in the past, and I don't think it will in the future either. So with that, Michael, let me hand it back to you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that framing, and because it's important, as I said, to start with the understanding this is complicated. It is, and people are complicated, and those complications, as you rightly noted, you know, inform how we should be looking at these things today. So really appreciate that explanation, and it's interesting with respect to Fergus's published work. I love this quote, particularly from the work you've done on Underground Railroad. They said, quote, "An important addition to our history, brilliantly told." And it is important to have individuals like yourself out here who put that framing in place for us and sort of lead us and guide us into understanding the times then versus the times now. We have this tendency, and we all do it, where we project back on our ancestors and the leaders of a particular time, our attitudes today. But it's important to have historians who actually give us the context, and we really appreciate that very much, sir. So let's continue to absorb the conversation, particularly given where we are, with a man who knows a little bit about the place we are, and is, as I noted earlier, recently elevated to the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. So, Ms. Sparrow, it's really, really great to be in your backyard, to have you here. We heard you say at your appointment, quote, 226 years ago, George Washington departed Philadelphia for Mount Vernon after his second presidential term. Now you too have left Philadelphia for Mount Vernon to start a new chapter in this dynamic and inspiring location. Make that connection for us in terms of your vision of this presidential library and how the nation should view it in the context of what we just heard.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And actually, if I could begin with a confession. Earlier, we've been talking, and I didn't realize you were in the Augustinian order.
Yeah.
Did you take confession then?
Yeah, well, yeah.
Okay, well, then, here's a flashback. I'm not a librarian.
You're not a librarian.
I'm actually a historian.
Right.
And that's a good way to kind of talk about where I see the presidential library and libraries more generally, and the role that they play in American society. I like to describe research libraries like the one we have here at Mount Vernon as the laboratory for the humanities. Just like scientists have a place where they conduct experiments, discover new drugs, or can help us understand and explain diseases, research libraries like the one that we have just over the street there are where historians like Fergus come and conduct original research. They ask new questions of the past and help us understand who we've been, how we got to where we are today, and help us imagine a better future. And so what I see at the Presidential Library here at Mount Vernon is to be a place to encourage people to come and do research, to acquire new documents that help us understand the past and understand George Washington. In fact, we recently acquired a document that I was thinking about when the mayor was speaking. It was a letter Washington wrote in 1785, and he's talking about his land in the Ohio River Valley and talking about how he didn't want it to turn into a slave plantation, that he was hoping it was going to be an area for free labor. And in this document, a historian can use this document to better understand that evolution that Fergus was talking about. And so that's where these documents still have things to tell us. And at the library, we want to invite more people into the library to do so, not just in person, but through digitization. We've digitized over 20,000 documents at the Presidential Library so far, and we have aspirations to do a lot more. We get 10,000 users of our digital library at Mount Vernon every month. That's way more than we could actually serve in person here. And then the third element to a research library, it's not just people coming here and doing research, it's also sharing their discoveries, their ideas with the wider world. And being what I think is, and I'm new to DC, as you mentioned, I was in Philadelphia before, I think the George Washington Presidential Library is the only presidential library in DC. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So. I don't think
Is that what Lindsay would know?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Fergus.
So,
You're right. I think you're right.
well, good. So I can say that. I've been saying that. No one's corrected me. So I assumed it was true. And now we've all recorded it. We know it's got to be true. But it can be a place that can be in conversations inspired by Washington's own time as president and leadership. And when I think about this moment, some of the core things from Washington's time that I think resonate today is Washington's devotion to union and how important union was to him. but also how fragile that union was. We talk today about how fragile our republic feels, and it certainly does feel that way, but that's actually not unique. And it was part of Washington's time. It was certainly part of Lincoln's time, as you've been talking about. Really, I would argue as a historian, our democracy has been unsettled more than it has been settled. And to provide some historical perspective on that, and especially to highlight the leadership that people like Washington have had to help us navigate these times, both the successes they had, but also their failures and shortcomings, because we can learn from failure as much as we can success. The other element of Washington's presidency that I think is so essential to who he is that he had Jefferson and Hamilton sitting at his table together. These incredible rivals who hated each other, and they hated each other because they disagreed on politics. But for Washington, he wanted that disagreement. It actually made him a better president to hear this debate and help inform better decisions. And he wasn't just a Hamiltonian. I think the rise of Hamilton that Ferguson was talking about is really, makes Washington seem like him and Hamilton were lockstep. They weren't. He agreed with Jefferson frequently and regularly, and he had that at that table. So how can this presidential library here in DC be a convener of conversations, both Republicans and Democrats, those in between, and maybe those outside of that spectrum itself? I have no idea how to do that. I was in Philadelphia before, so if people have ideas or can offer help, I'm open to that. And then the final element of Washington's time that I think about here at Mount Vernon is the idea of education. Everybody in the 18th century in Europe said democracy, no way that's going to work. Democracy leads to anarchy and tyranny. It's the rule of the masses. You need a king to rise above the rabble to decide what's best for a country. Now, Washington rejected that. He believed in democracy, but he also heard what they said, and he knew that this democracy could fail, and he worried about it. And he said, what's the answer to this critique? It's education. A democracy is only as strong as its citizenry. And education is the bulwark to defend that democracy. So when Washington died, he emancipated his slaves, but he also left an endowment to a national university. It was supposed to be in DC. That
I know it,
I
yeah.
don't think it ever happened.
Well, we finally got it.
Took a long time.
But it's places like Mount Vernon that can take that idea and serve it and be an area that can educate citizens about the past, about civics, so that we can be a defender of democracy, because I think that's what our nation needs today.
Very well said. Roland Quanda, Judge Roland Quanda, I've known him for a very long time, so
You didn't want to say how many years.
you can help us understand the contradiction. You have family members who were enslaved here at Mount Vernon, and I believe your work of chronicling your family is about the only really work where you can chronicle an enslaved family, an African-American family from, was it 1864, certain until today.
1684.
1684, and it transposed.
Thank
That
you,
makes it
thank
much
you.
more significant.
1684,
but you said you can even go back further than
Yes,
that,
yes,
probably.
yes.
All right. Can you help us? How do you see George Washington? Someone that so
Well, we
many
can-
of us here
Yeah.
admire, but tell us, what is your sense of it?
Well, we use the word complexity. We use the word challenge. We use the word threat as far as the survival of our democracy and our country as a nation. But I think we also have to realize that the strength of who we are today and how we got here is deeply rooted in the backbones of those who physically built this country. Block on block, brick on brick. Can't see in the morning, but can't see at night. 6 days a week, sometimes 7. And they are the unsung. So books could be written, and book on the Quanda family, like you mentioned, the Quanda since 1684, an enduring African-American legacy. It's in the bookstore. What we wanted to do and what we have done, as chronicling our history, we discovered that actually we go back another decade into the 1670s, possibly even the 1660s, and transcend over to the Fanti people in Ghana, West Africa, where the name Kwanda and Amkwando Fonte names, where we believe we came from. But the strength that we have is one of resilience, focus, determination, and most importantly, is not necessarily at all unique, because there are so many African American families who are based from Africa, of course, who brought that resilience, that strength, that focus, that determination to prove that what they knew from across the water in Africa could be transcended to here in the New World. The techniques in terms of food ways, music ways, architecture ways, doesn't necessarily mean you had to build a pyramid, but you could take a stepping stone and turn it into a building. You could take those lemons and turn it into lemonade. And as time progressed, there are so many records that were written of resistance. And fortunately, our name shows up in a number of them. In one particular case, the enslaver in 1684, just across the river from the Maryland side, wrote his will and he provided for the eventual freedom of his enslaved. Wrote that will in 1684. When he died in 1686, that created a situation where they were freed. But we carried the story of a brother who did not get his freedom, had another master, and we were looking for that master, looking for that brother. And guess what? I'm not saying we have it, but a couple of months ago we may have found it. And what is it? I'm saying it's a definite maybe. You've heard that term before. So where did that come from? All right, I think everybody in this room knows about the Georgetown 272 project. Georgetown University had a history of having sold off, Georgetown College then, a lot of enslaved Africans. They weren't Americans. The Dred Scott decision said they weren't American citizens and could never be. You know how long never is or was? All right. And if the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment hadn't come along, we'd still be maybe in servitude. But anyway, the Georgetown Project said we're going to see if we can find where those 272 people's descendants are. And they started looking, and as they started looking, they found that beyond the Georgetown group, there were others. And our ancestors, having the name Quanda, were not in the Georgetown group, but guess what? They showed up in Louisiana. So we're going to look to see where these people came from. Where did they come from? And in the overwhelming majority of the cases, they looked at the ship manifest showing up in New Orleans and in Mississippi, and these names they tracked it back, and they were shipped from Franklin and Ailes. They were shipped from Annapolis. And who sold them, who transported them, who sold them off and transferred them? Other members of the Washington family. That was quite a surprise. We think that might be the answer, we're not sure, as to what happened to the other brother. But our family's history, and it's not unique because others have done the same. You may not know the details and specifics of your family, but I assure you, your family has a history. And I'm always telling people, don't talk about the Quantas have done this, that, and the other. That's us. But we want it to be an inspiration for what other people can do and have done. The 1619 Project is just an example. As I like to say, civil rights, we talk about, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It didn't start then. The civil rights movement, from my perspective, started in August 1619, right here in this state, down in Port Comfort, downstate Virginia. And the Black strength, the Black resilience, the Black focus, the Black determination, the Black creativity is who we are. And what he said just now, or said about building the White House and building the United States Capitol, we also were involved in building the first Smithsonian, the castle. Also building other places like the foundation for the Washington Monument, laying out of the original streets. And this is not necessarily somebody with the Quanda name, but it's somebody who was focused, determined, and spiritual. We brought with us a certain degree of spirituality from Africa. Many of us transitioned that into what we call Christianity. And like Michael here, I was educated by Augustine. You went to the same high school. Yeah, he came after me. I think he graduated last year. But you've got to understand that this place that we live in is a very complicated place. It's a place that evolved over time. And I was just looking, reviewing what Frederick Douglass said about what to the slave is the meaning of the 4th of July. And he delivered that on July the 5th, 1852, talking one day after. And he said several admirable things about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, the founding fathers, what great men, what great heroes, how brave they were, how determined and focused they were. And then he switched, because he brought up the institution and said, all of this liberty, equality, fraternity, and hope that they were talking about breaking away from George III, why is it that that didn't extend to those who were enslaved? And he says, the evil that men do lives after them. So he was recognizing the heroes, and he was recognizing the flaws, the humanity. I mean, I had a cousin, an ancestor, whose probate papers were filed on July the 2nd, 1776. She died in June. And I often wonder, what would Margaret Quando have said, knowing that this forthcoming Declaration of Independence is coming forth officially on the 4th of July. Her papers are filed on the 2nd of July. What would she have said about the promises and the hopes that had been embodied into that document that wouldn't apply to her? She was Black, even if she was free. She was a woman. She didn't have any property to speak of, and not being a white male with property, she couldn't vote. And her focus was not lost on us, because we have records, court records, tax records, many of those court records where we fought in court against somebody or even each other and lost. But what did it show? Entrepreneurship, determination, I will not be denied. And that is the message that we like as Quandas to bring forth. We're the only African-American family with 4 generals. Only. We're the only African-American family that had 2 commandants at West Point. That's the number 2 man, including the one that just left last week, General Mark Quanda. And I'm so honored that just yesterday I was called and asked to be the keynote speaker at Fort Belvoir because they're removing Robert E. Lee's name from Main Street. And they asked me, they're going to, the executive order, I'm going to 9811 if I got it right, that integrated the Army in 1948. I am honored to be asked to be the keynote speaker and bring the knowledge of these men and women, because we had many women involved, to the forefront, to realize that this is who we are as Americans. This is who we are. We look for a colorblind society. We're not there yet. But we say all men are created equal. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson, even if you didn't believe it. We people, thank you, James Madison, if you didn't believe it. But we're coming to a more perfect union. In 3 years or 2.5, we'll be celebrating our 250th anniversary. And we, Wanda and you two, are far closer to that more perfect union in the year 2026, we hope, than we were, say, in 1926 or 1826. So it's a privilege for me to be here on behalf, not of the Quanda family, but on behalf of the enslaved community from here, because we have an organization called the League of Descendants of the Mount Vernon Enslaved. And our purpose is to identify, document, preserve, protect, and share the legacy of the unsung, because we want others in the broader communities, and Montpelier has one, and Monticello has one, and Whitney in Louisiana has one, and Middleton, South Carolina, and others. We want people to know that this country was built upon the backs of the enslaved, many of whom never got any recognition, many of whom died, and we don't even know their names. But we're going to shout their names, or at least collectively. So it's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about that in the context of what this whole thing is about, as we look at our founding fathers and give them their praise, but also recognize they were human, they had flaws. But we concentrate on the upside, and we look forward to what the foundation they laid to be that upon which we continue to build for our future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you much. So Ms. Parker, I'm going to pick up on what Judge Quander laid out in terms of the sort of familiar aspects of all of this. These, we tend to look at the enslaved in sort of a broad, generic space.
Yeah.
not in an individualized space. There's actual families, there's lineage, there's history. And you are very, very familiar with that. That is your work, your passion, to lay out those stories. You're an educator, historical interpreter of these storylines. Give us a sense of your work and the lives of the enslaved on a plantation like Mount Vernon and the surrounding plantations at this time, and some of the individuals who kind of stand out today, but were invaluable at the time to making this place work.
Yeah. I look at them as individuals, 317. That's the number that I always hear. 317 men, women, children, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers. They were individual people with individual lives and hopes and dreams and aspirations, same as everybody and anybody. And I did take it on as a passion project. You know, it still is very passionate for me to do that. But one particular story that I think of that still resonates with me a little bit, excuse me, voice is tired, is the story of young William. William was the son of Kate and William. His father, he was named after his father. He did have a brother as well, but William was a young man who was set to work alongside of his father. His father worked as a ditcher here on the estate, and a ditcher is kind of like an engineer of sorts, responsible for making sure that the irrigation was proper, foundations of the buildings were made to where they would last and stay up and everything and things like that. But his mother was a field worker, and just working out in the fields, you know, it's hard enough labor as it is, but knowing that your young son is also working alongside of his father in such a dangerous profession as that kind of engineering type of work. William, he was like any other child, I'd imagine, to where he would get in and out of trouble, and he would have sick days and he would have well days. But one particular day, he was taken ill, and he told his mother that he was ill and he wasn't feeling well, and he had a pain in his back. That's all. The only complaint that he had is that he had a pain in his back. And after 7 days of him having this pain in his back, he died. The child died. And I can't imagine the grief that the mother must have gone through, you know, knowing that her child died. But the one thing that was commented on as far as the overseer's report was that his death was much regretted because he was a promising child. Not because he was a child of this person, but because the potential that he had in his life and everything. And that it broke my heart when I read that. It just absolutely broke my heart to where instead of them thinking of them as 317 individual persons, there were 317 pieces of property, which is a terrible way to look at it, but that's the way that it was looked at during that time period. There was also mention by the overseer that this wasn't the first time the child had taken ill. He had also experienced a car accident about a year before, and his mother, again, being concerned about him, decided to keep him in with her for a little bit longer before sending him back out to work again with her father, with his father and everything like that. And so the overseer had pretense. He thought that she was just keeping him in and he was well, and that he was just feigning illness to get out of labor and to get out of work. And when I think of the amount of times that, you know, people have done that to get out of labor, can you really blame them? Right. Can you really blame them after all of that is said and done? Do you really blame them for that? But getting back to the loss of him as a child, as a human being, as a person in the community. I can imagine the rest of the community just gathering together to help, with the grieving in the mourning of the loss of this particular child, in the process of just their day-to-day living, and how it wasn't looked at as being significant enough for them to do anything to honor or to pay, respect to this poor little child, this poor child. And that's not the only child that, that perishes. It's when a woman would give birth to a child, she was given the annual blanket for them. Everybody received a blanket as part of their rations of clothing. But if that child perished, they'd have to give the blanket back, And so you don't even have that little token to remember your child that's, that's passed on, and everything like that. And it makes me think about like today's society, to where a woman can go in and she can give birth to a child, and, and thinking about saying, I feel this pain here, or I feel this pain there. How sometimes it's overlooked if you're a certain economic background, or if you have a certain color skin, to where they just automatically assume that you're just trying to get more drugs or special treatment or special care, when that wasn't the case at all. And again, it just comes back down to us being individuals and human people, and recognizing each other as human people, which they weren't recognized as human people at all, that we're just pieces of property, just, with potential.
Yeah.
With
Yeah.
potential.
No, it's powerful.
Thank
And the beauty of what you've done is that, you remind us, and as we must be reminded of, is the humanity. And if we deal with it, as a topic, we just sort of skim over it. But it's important to remember the humanity. And the beauty of George Washington, I think, in part as a segue, is that he had a gift as a leader to connect with people. It possibly could explain why he was the only one of that group that did manumit upon his death. Because I think as a soldier, he got to know some of those men, including William Lee, as a human being. But you really do delve into that brilliantly, I'd have to say, Lindsay Travinsky, with the cabinet, because he had to create out of whole cloth a notion of what a president was. Everybody was terrified of monarchical qualities in a president, and he created this institution, the cabinet. Could you sort of elaborate on his strengths or limitations, however you see it, of George Washington as a leader?
Absolutely. Well, I think you set it up so nicely that he did have really extraordinary, what we would call today emotional intelligence or emotional IQ. He did not have a very fancy education. He was constantly trying to improve his own skills and knowledge, but so much of what made him who he was, and I know we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but was his experience during the war. And as historians, sometimes we fall into the trap of Washington the general or Washington the president, but they were, of course, the same person. And he was very much shaped by what had come before him. And that war experience was so essential for so many different reasons. Certainly it shaped how he thought about slavery and how he thought about the potential for Black people who he had really only interacted with in a plantation environment to serve with extraordinary valor and bravery and to fight for their own freedom. And it changed how he thought about humans and what they could do. It also shaped in him a sense of a national identity. He was the first sort of nationalist as an American because he traveled across the country. He went up and down and all over the place at a time when people were not doing that. One of my favorite facts is in 1774 when the delegates met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. More delegates had been to London than had been to Philadelphia. And it was because they were British. They weren't Americans, they were British. And so the lodestar of culture and education and finance and all of those things was London. It wasn't an American city. And so he was the first person to really travel in such a way that allowed him to see all of the differences in the nation, but also to see it as one thing. And it's no accident that if you look at the first federal Congress, which Fergus has written about brilliantly, so many people in the first federal Congress had served in the military. And it was because they had this sense of nationalism. They weren't Virginians, they weren't New Yorkers. I mean, they were, but they were Americans. And one of Washington's incredible strengths coming into the presidency, and generally I avoid language like this because I think that it can be hyperbolic. He was the only person that could be the first president because he was the only person that had the national stature, the name to be recognizable, other than Benjamin Franklin, but he was very, very, very old and he died the first year of Washington's presidency because he was in very poor health. So other than Benjamin Franklin, he was the only person that had the stature. He was the only person to be trusted with the extraordinary power that you talked about. He had already given up power once. And that was, something we kind of, I think, gloss over today. But they were living in the age of Napoleon. This was not something that they expected people to do. So they trusted him to hold that kind of power. And what was remarkable about Washington was he knew that he was the only person that could do it. He knew that if he didn't do it, it was going to fall apart. And as Fergus said, this was their second chance. Most nations don't get second chances. Their second chances mean, war, anarchy, and revolution. And we got a second chance. And so he knew if he did not seize it, it was going to absolutely fall apart. So he came into the presidency, and every single action he took, every single one, established precedent because there was no model. There was nothing for him to follow. And if we look at the text of the Constitution, it is remarkably short. I think we have the second shortest national constitution in the world. So there's almost nothing written down about what he's supposed to do or how he's supposed to do it or in which way he's supposed to do it or what he's supposed to wear while doing it or how he's supposed to travel or who he's supposed to socialize with or how is he supposed to work with Congress. These are all things that he had to figure out. And one of the biggest pieces, the thing that I have spent a lot of my time writing and researching on, was how to actually do the governing of the presidency. And the cabinet was his creation as a way to try and manage that process. Also in the bookshop, if you find yourself interested in reading more. I believe they have signed copies. And the cabinet was an extraordinary institution because it was very flexible. Nothing was written down. It was all about what the president wanted and what the president needed at any given moment. And sometimes that meant that he wanted to have people like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson sitting around a table arguing, debating. He wanted that conflict so that he could learn from it. And sometimes when he had what I affectionately call the B team, when they left office and the replacements weren't so great, he didn't really want to talk to them because they weren't very helpful. And he didn't really trust them as much, and he trusted his own judgment. So that emotional intelligence of understanding how to lead, how to put together an institution basically from scratch. And the fact that that institution has still survived today is freaking remarkable.
It is.
Because it just, it's not something we really see all that much in human history. And so that creation was one that was done with incredible care and dedication to detail. And it's not nearly as sexy as winning the Civil War or winning World War II or any of those things. So he tends to not have the same sort of reverence in the American mind, the American memory as some of those other presidents. But the restraint, knowing when not to say something, knowing when not to do something, knowing the importance of showing up, that was really quite remarkable.
Really, I agree.
Amazing. And a lot of that, Judge Quander, is also the African American experience in parallel, knowing when to hold back, when to move forward, when to press. It is part of our story since 1619.
Yes.
And we find ourselves pressing even more so today under certain circumstances as the rights that took 200 years to get in place are evaporating right in front of us. How, if you could, should we look at this moment, contextualizing history, contextualizing what we just heard about how people hold back, lean in order to continue the march towards that perfect union?
Well, I think first of all, the past has never passed. The past is with us today. The past is the present. The past is the present or the future. And we've got to understand that we have a very stony the road past as African Americans, not even Americans from the beginning. Our first forebears were brought here in chains in 1619. They had a focus. They had a determination. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know which direction Africa was. They just knew that they had to stick together, because if they didn't stick together, and then sticking together was a difficult task when you came from different places in a continent and didn't speak the same language. But you quickly came to realize that it was a case of us versus them, whoever the them was. And I think that we have such a strong historical past. And I'm always encouraging young people. I'm a licensed certified tour guide. I'm here several times a year. In that capacity, I saw some people from the company I work with tell me they recognized me with a tie on and not having short pants today. We have a strong message. We have a legacy. And our legacy is one of strength, of uprising and rising up. The Divine Nine fraternities and sororities, of which I am a 60-year member of Omega Psi Phi, Sharon and I pledged the same year, Alpha Kappa Alpha, lift as you climb. As you go up, we have this inner psyche that we have to always take somebody with us. Because what good does it do if I make myself or go somewhere and I look down and kick the ladder out from under me? I won't mention any names. You know who I'm talking about. This is not who we are as a people. It's very important, I think, and too many of us have forgotten, even in our own race, African-American race, a number of us have forgotten. We've gotten to certain places where we think we've arrived. Well, all you need is one bad election and you'll find out how unarrived you are. And you'll also find out how you open your mouth. And if you said that in Florida, for example, it might take you away. So it's really a case of unity and strength in unity. And I think the African-American community, as much as we have, just like in democracy, we're pulling and pushing, twisting and turning, I think we still have a focus. It's built around church. It's built around formal education. It's built around taking somebody with you. So I believe in all of those principles. We've got to be men and women. We have to be educated, which is scholarship. We must persevere. We must uplift. And that's the question of service. That's what it's all about. And I think that's where it is, to me.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Patrick Sparrow, you have focused a lot on the indigenous people of this nation. And we talk about, different cultures and their struggles. But to a great extent, there were great civilizations here. There was a capital here long before any of us thought about it. Can you sort of elaborate on how that may have informed or impacted the Revolutionary War or the America that resulted?
Well, Mayor, are you known for asking a big, tough question?
I didn't mean
So everybody's been talking about their books that are available in the shops. The book Frontier Rebels that you mentioned is actually a study on the coming of the American Revolution, showing the place and significance of Native Americans to that story. And I didn't plan on writing that book. I actually was interested in why did people outside of the urban seaports decide to rebel? How did they react to the Stamp Act or the Tea Party? And what I found was they didn't even talk about that stuff by and large, but they did talk a lot about Native American relations, land, and that really influenced a lot of their perceptions of the British Empire and the reasons for their decision to declare independence themselves and fight. But as I was sitting here and hearing some of these conversations, what interests me is how looking at Native Americans can change what we think about Washington and his decision making and his leadership. And there are two. I'll share two kind of stories. The first is, here's a pop quiz. The first treaty signed under the Constitution was with what nation? Fergus is nodding. But, pardon me?
Iroquois, wasn't it?
No, close. The Creek.
Creek.
The Creek in 1790. And what I would argue is a lot of scholars working today, especially in foreign relations, they're influenced by where we are as a country today, the global superpower. When they teach foreign policy and the history of foreign policy, and they begin with Washington, they're talking a lot about the relations with the French and with the British and the Atlantic. They're not looking west or with Indian relations. And in fact, I would argue that Washington's #1 priority in terms of foreign diplomacy was with Native American groups and nations. And in fact, the largest allocation of federal resources was towards the army in the forts in the West. And so that should change the way we think about the nation, the founding, and also how Washington is imagining grand strategy. And in fact, if you think about what maybe is his most significant foreign policy decision, I mean, Lindsay might disagree with me on this, but it's the neutrality policy in 1793. Here are, the French Revolution has happened. It's a new republic. The British and the Spanish, which are still monarchies, fear that this Republican is going to sweep across Europe and depose monarchs everywhere. And so there's this conflict, a war between France and Great Britain and Spain. And they're pushing, all three nations are challenging Washington to take a side. The French say, we fought with you in the American Revolution. You signed this treaty with us. You owe it to us to side with us and help us in this conflict. And then Great Britain is saying, you need to support us because you know what, we've got forts on the west and we could take this over. Washington decides to maintain neutrality, and it's often cast as he's trying to maintain commercial relations with both the French and the British. He doesn't want to engage in this Atlantic war. It will actually help solidify trade if he maintains neutrality. But if you actually put in the context of what's happening with Native Americans, that decision takes on even a different light. Mm-hmm. Because 2 years previously, the American army suffered its greatest defeat. Arthur St. Clair in 1791, there was a multi-year long Indian war. And so here's Washington thinking about a European war, knowing that the American army has essentially been devastated and did not exist. And so why does he want to maintain neutrality? Not just for those commercial reasons, but because he actually can't because of what has happened with Native Americans in the West. And so just looking at it differently helps you understand Washington himself in his presidency.
No, that's a very powerful point. Thank you.
It is. And that idea of looking at it differently is something I want to bring to you, Ms. Parker, because everyone, again, talking about the environment in which slavery occurred, the organization and structure on a plantation, and this idea that, you know, life was better for the enslaved who worked in the big house, and less so for those who worked in the fields. But your work says we may need to look at that and appreciate that narrative a little bit differently. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes. Regardless of whom you were, you did receive rations of clothing as well as rations for food. The only difference between the rations for clothing that you might have received if you worked inside of the mansion house was they were of lesser quality as far as fabric, but the same design as the mistress of the household or the master of the household. For example, somebody like William Lee was charged to wear a 3-piece military style suit called, oh goodness gracious, Liberty. Yes, thank you, livery. It went right out of my head. They were supposed to wear a livery suit, and the reason why they would wear this particular livery suit was so that they would be recognized as the property of, you know, fill in the blank. And the same thing would apply to the young women that worked inside of the household, whatever position they were in the household. Again, they're wearing similar clothing to the mistress of the household, but of lesser quality. And so the ones working in the fields, they're receiving clothes, and the ones working in the house are receiving clothes. And again, you're saying that the clothes that they received to work in the field were, you know, just a couple of shifts, a petticoat, a pair of stockings, one pair of shoes. You know, you get your wool blanket, you get your wool, you know, short gown, you know, for your clothing. And the gentlemen are receiving themselves a couple pairs of breeches, a pair of, you know, a shirt, a pair of stockings, a pair of shoes, you know, and a short jacket again for the winter months. And they're getting this annual supply for these clothing. Okay, you're saying these people are wearing, you know, poor quality things, and these people are, you know, looking a little ragtag, and they're having to live and sleep and breathe and do everything in this one set of clothing. And these people over here, they're working in the house, so it must be better for them. Imagine that you're a 12-year-old young woman and you've been assigned to work inside of the house. The master of the house is away fighting a revolutionary war. And there are all kinds of contractors coming in and out of that house that are there. Think about it. And the master is away. Who's going to protect that young woman? Who's going to protect that young man? There's nobody there to protect them. The law says that you cannot strike a white person. You cannot resist. You know, you cannot fight back. You can't defend yourself. So again, they're in this position to where they're 100% vulnerable, regardless of the clothes that they wear. Ona Judge is the perfect example. Yeah. The perfect example for the privileges of being in the house and working in the house does not always, you know, add to your benefit or to, you know, to the outcome. She was a person that was given, you know, silk slippers, you know, whenever she wanted them. She got several changes of, you know, really nice clothing, so many that they didn't even know what she ran away with when she did run away, you know, but yet still she determined in her heart and in her mind that she was not going to die a slave, you know, and she, you know, took her own liberty, you know, really nice book too. Yeah, also in the bookstore. But these people's lives were, again, you know, you get down to the bottom of it. Again, their lives were their lives, and they lived their lives, you know, to the best and the fullest, you know, and it didn't make any difference whether you worked in the field or whether you worked in the house. If you're still considered somebody's property at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what kind of shoes you have on. If you're still considered somebody's property at the end of the day. I used to tell this story when I was interpreting as a character interpreter. And I'd say my son, my youngest son, one of my sons was Christopher, one of my sons. And I'd say, you know, it's like my young son, you know, thinks he's all fancy now because he works, you know, for Master Washington. And he's been given a fancy, you know, livery and everything, and he would just strut about all day long. And then he'd say to me, Mama, call me by my name, you know. And I would say to him, it's like, your name is Christopher, you know. It's like, no, Mama, call me by my fancy name, you know. It's like, you know, what I do for, you know, for the master. And he says, well, you are a valet, you know. It's like, that's what you do for the master. And the child would think to himself, you know, I'm this big important person because I do this thing for the master. And I'd say to him, and I said, do you not have, you know, pairs of shoes? Does not the master have pairs of shoes? He has one set of shoes for dancing, and those are just for dancing. He has another pair of shoes for, you know, for riding his horse. Those are just for riding a horse. You know, he has another pair of shoes, you know, for fancy meetings and things like that. I said, at the end of the day, all three of those pairs of shoes, they come off and they go in the closet someplace. They're discarded. I said, you're thought of the same as a pair of shoes, to where, you know, somebody can put you on for a particular thing, you know, and you're just to look good. And then at the end of the day, those shoes come off of the feet, you know. It was like, that is what you're thought of. I said, but to me, you're special. You know, to me, you're my child. To me, you are important. You know, that's the way we have to look at it, instead of just saying, you know, it was better in the house than it was in the fields. At the end of the day, there were all pairs of shoes that all got taken off, and all got thrown away over here or sat over there, there weren't any more important than anything else. Again, they were movable property, so to speak, instead of persons, the 317 persons that I came to identify with very closely. Yeah.
Well put.
Well put.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So what we want to do now is open it up to Q&A because I figure some of y'all out there may have a question or two of this great panel, and so we'll do that, and then we'll in this part of the program and get ready for the next part where I hear there's food involved, so I'm happy. But I really like to throw it open for anyone in the audience. If you have a question, that you could stand up, state your question, and we'll be happy to answer from there. I think we've got a mic that's coming, or we've got a question over here. And so just keep in mind, I said question, not speech. History, just
Back right.
question.
Please wait for the microphone.
Can someone explain if there was some other event other than Washington's time as the head of the Revolutionary Army that further informed his decision to free his slaves that he owned at his death? Was there some person who influenced him, some other event other than the Revolutionary War? Because this is really a big change or decision for him to have made.
Yeah, well, there are various ways of answering that, but I think the one of the most interesting is to focus on the Marquis de Lafayette, whom he had an enormous respect for and admiration for, and thought of in a certain way as almost a surrogate son. Lafayette was an abolitionist, French, of course, but much more advanced than almost anybody in the United States at the time, and argued strenuously, vigorously with Washington to declare himself an opponent of slavery and to declare slavery unwanted in the new United States. Washington took him very seriously. He thought about it. And it seems he was, at least in his heart, close to going along with what Lafayette proposed. However, as we discussed earlier, the country was so fragile, he came to believe, and he was far from alone, that this fragile arrangement of states would collapse. And it's an example of the kind of, dare I say, cruel compromise or concession that was so typical with respect to slavery in this country. I think Washington, in his assumption, was probably correct. We can't, it's hard to be sympathetic, but I don't think he was actually factually wrong about the significance.
Right there.
Well, I understand that slavery was one of the most debated issues during the Constitutional Convention, and it was a compromise for that 2/3 of a person type of situation that ended up. So when Washington emancipated his enslaved persons on his death, is that another precedent? Or was that a common situation that people emancipated, didn't do anything while they were alive, but emancipated when they were dying?
That was
Unusual.
It was very unusual. And what's interesting is Washington was, Fergus, you're disagreeing? Okay.
I think it depended a lot on the state. It depended a lot on the state.
Yeah, so what's interesting to me is that Washington, this was his final act, and it was known. And there was actually somebody who founded the AME church in Philadelphia, the first free black church. His name was Richard Allen. And he gave a eulogy that really brought this to the fore, with the idea that he was going to eulogize Washington, and this was going to be reprinted in newspapers, and people beyond just Washington Circle or Philadelphia would know more about it. We have a copy of that eulogy. It was published in Boston, but the truth is it was largely suppressed and not republished in the South or elsewhere. So Washington, I think, had hoped that this final act would have an influence, but in some measure, many Americans weren't ready to hear it and did not want to share it.
No, I agree with that. I think I would just say that, in certain places like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, and even in some cases New York, where there was a growing sentiment for abolition, it was more common, but it was very unusual for the South. And that was partly because there were laws on the books in a lot of southern states, or increasingly laws on the books, that either prevented manumission or required any individuals who were freed to leave the state within a year. And so if your family is still enslaved, that's a very difficult decision. And so I think it became increasingly rare in the South.
Yes, back here.
I'd like to get the panel's opinion on just nothing more than a thought. Certainly, we've fortunate to have past presidents that have had significant military experience. Do you think the country in the future will embrace another candidate or another president with those kinds of leadership skills to move our country forward?
I'm looking at the current crop of things. Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think one of the, at least from my thinking on it, is watching what's happened since 9/11. The number of men and women who served Iraq War, Afghanistan War, been engaged in the defense of the nation, some very publicly, others not so publicly, particularly in the cyberspace and in areas like that, who now find themselves running for office, are entering public service as governors, entering public service as members of Congress. It'll be interesting to see how this generation that is creating almost a post 9/11 foundation for military and political leadership emerge further up the ranks. So you have someone like Ron DeSantis who's running. You have others who served, who are running. That is an interesting dynamic. Will Hurd is a very good example of someone who was running now, but likely is sort of setting an opportunity for the future, both military service and secret service with the CIA. And so it'll be interesting to see how the country responds to that kind of leadership, particularly given that there was that period where it was rejected after Vietnam in many respects. But 9/11 kind of changed that presidential narrative. And I think it's a quality that, quite honestly, I think the country may look to as our relations around the globe continue to evolve, and in some cases devolve. You're going to want someone who has some understanding and appreciation, not resting solely on Congress, or in particular the Senate, to play the roles that they have in the past, certainly post-Vietnam. It's the initial thought.
If I may add to that, if I could, we live in a world now where we sort of function in silos because we can, with the social media and so forth. One of the unique qualities of the military has been it's always led on diversity. From the inception of the country, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the first integration occurred in the military. Women, the role of women dramatically. It could be the best laboratory in America for a leader. you know, it's one of the few places where you're sort of forced to sort of live within that complex America. So I think it could be a great launching pad. Just a thought.
So I'm going to assume your question means someone who serves at the highest level of the military. Because we've had, over the course of American history, we've had generations where every single president for 20 years, served in World War II. Every single president for 20 years served in the Civil War. Every single president for 20 years had some sort of role in the revolution. And it was expected that if we had these huge national moments, we expected that our leaders would play a role in some sort of service. What I think is different about Washington, and there are two other exceptions to this, is Grant and Eisenhower. They were at the top of the top of the top of the top of the military when they left, and then were basically drafted into political service. That's complicated in a republic because we want to have a separation between the military and civilian leadership. We work really hard to protect that, and we should. It's really important to have a civilian oversight of the military and to maintain that distinction. It's really important that the military is not politicized. We don't want a politicized military. And yet, there's a reason that those three presidents are, I would argue, among the most impactful at turning points in the nation. And it's because once they left, they were of such elevated stature and respect, and they could bring in the type of leadership that was required in a turning point. I don't know, given where we are now, where that sort of elevated military leadership, the military is a profession. It is a calling, and it is something that you do. If you reach that level, you are in there for most of your life service. I don't know how many of those individuals would then be interested in running for politics. And frankly, I wouldn't really blame them. But it would require the right person who had the right sort of, level of esteem, but had been out of the military a little bit long enough such that they weren't politicizing. So it's a very it has to be a very right set of circumstances, but it could be very powerful, as we have seen been in the past.
I think the most recent example that one might cite is somebody who ultimately chose not to run. That's Colin Powell.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's actually a very good example.
Yeah.
Of that. Got time for one more? Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted a point of clarification, and I'm not a historian, so I apologize for that. I was of the understanding that President Washington manumitted his slave upon his wife's death and not upon his death.
Correct.
And that she therefore lived in fear of harm following his death. So I think this speaks to the rights or the lack thereof of women, for example, in their security. But please, talk about that a little.
That is, that's 100% correct that you had that, there. There's also, you're probably quoting what was said to, was it Abigail Adams, I think it was, that she was in fear for her safety, with the slaves being there. I personally look at it a little bit differently because I'm thinking that the freed slave population and the enslaved population, they were still going about life as usual. And the reason why the ones that were freed remained here was because they had family. So they're not going to do anything to jeopardize, they're standing with the, on the estate because they're in fear of what's going to happen to their family because their family is still in very real danger of being sold away and being sent away. So I'm thinking it was probably a lot less peaceful. I mean, a lot more peaceful around here than, you would think about, as far as, nobody's planning any uprisings or rebellions. And that's just the way that I look at it
Right.
personally.
No, that's a good point.
It's a very good
Yeah.
point.
One moment of context for that I think is really important. I totally agree with you, and I think you're right. So Washington died in December of 1799. The following August was Gabriel's Rebellion.
Yeah.
And that was in Richmond and Norfolk and some of the other cities farther south. And they were quite explicit. Gabriel was quite explicit that he was borrowing the revolutionary rhetoric. He had a flag made that he made himself that said death or liberty, and an intentional inversion of liberty or death. But the existence of these plots were, I think, were such a pervasive fear that it caused people like Martha to often say she had these fears, even if she didn't necessarily have concrete evidence that they were in existence, because it was such a part of the ethos and the rhetoric at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do want to thank this incredible panel. Just a wonderful, fruitful conversation. I also want to thank our wonderful audience and ask you, you'll probably each have a card where we welcome your comments as a part of a survey. W.K. Kellogg Foundation is eager to get your reflections, and there you can see the card right there up on the screen. So we thank you if you would do that. That would be a wonderful help, very instructive to us. And also, before we conclude this occasion, I'd like to introduce you to the president of the organization that is the premier sponsor for today's conversation, Events DC, and we have with us President Angie Gates.
Well, good afternoon, everyone.
Good
afternoon.
So first, let me say thank you to Mayor Sharon Pratt, the Senior Advisory Committee, the panelists. I mean, wow, I started watching some of the stuff streaming, but like once I got here, I'm like, wow, what a day you all have had. The entire Institute of Politics Policy History team across the board. I mean, I know you all have been working. My team has been talking to you multiple times. So thank you, because I know it takes a lot of hard work to pull these type of events off. Also want to say thank you to the George Washington Mount Vernon's team as well. I want to acknowledge Mayor Muriel Bowser and Secretary Lonnie Bunch, who, from my understanding, will be joining us a little later. So today's important conversation clearly has been enlightening, and so has the Q&A, like just catching that part of it. But the Founding Fathers series is so important. This series educates people on how decisions are made by our founding fathers still are impacting us today. These conversations trigger us to think deeply about how many leaders, not only founding fathers, but through our history, were making policy decisions that still affect us today, not only locally, but nationally. So we are in a time where our city in Washington, D.C. particularly, is most diverse and inclusive. So it's conversations like today that create a safe space for our opportunity to dialogue and just kind of look at things from a different lens and take a new perspective, right? These conversations are necessary so that we can understand the history and make the necessary changes needed to create a better society and a brighter future. I am so proud that Events DC is the premier sponsor of this year's Founding Fathers Legacy Series. This type of discussion we will do and continue to discuss beyond today talks about our city and allows us to give an opportunity to discuss how culturally rich our city is. And we got to talk about this with our visitors and our tourists that are coming in and out of the convention center and everywhere when it comes to the events that we're hosting. So Events DC, in case you don't know, is the premier host of convention, sports, entertainment, and cultural events in the nation's capital. Events DC focuses on economic impact and community benefits for the residents, businesses of the District of Columbia by creating dynamic event experiences and promoting Washington, D.C. as a world-class destination. Some of that work focuses on the culture of our city, which is solidly said, built on the history of our city. This year, we are adding a Walking Town DC tour to our portfolio. In recent years, it was hosted by Cultural Tourism. It's now under the Events DC portfolio. And this walking tour DC attracts thousands of people to participate in guided walking tours throughout all 8 wards of Washington, DC. This introduces residents and tourists to our history, art, and lifestyle. And you know, we got a lot of lifestyle in Washington, DC, right? The key point here is that it's free. So this annual program is free. It takes place in September, so I really hope you all can join us. Events DC is supporting the efforts of Mayor Muriel Bowser's administration to grow and develop the historic St. Elizabeth's community. We have the entertainment and sports arena, and that investment has provided an economic impact through jobs, housing, and retail options. Going back to the convention center, we encourage our meeting planners to explore our city, focus on our history, and more importantly, which you all have done a lot today, is learn the authentic story and the authentic culture. We also have our cultural institution grants, which that began maybe about 3 years ago. And that's designed to enhance the visitor's experience by supporting nonprofit cultural institutions based in the district that conserve, interpret, and disseminate cultural and historical knowledge about our city. So Events DC has many purposes, but I can tell you the snippet that I've heard today, clearly this is one of the most important ones.
Thank you, Angie.
To support and grow Washington, DC, to attract and educate people to our town, it aligns with exactly what you're doing. And I want to share a little bit of a personal story. So I grew up in the South. I grew up in New Orleans and in Mississippi. So to hear the things you talk about. So as a little girl walking through the cotton fields, I had my great-grandmother was, well, I should say my great-great-grandmother was a slave. My great-grandmother lived to be 104 years old. And like just this takes me back to my history, my genes, my legacy. So I know my mama and my papa are very proud to see me stand here today and put an investment of what has taken place. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. That's nice. That is a beautiful, beautiful way to end our conversation. Thank you so much for that framing. Just a really, really nice bookend. Well, Mayor, I think we're done.
All right.
I think we're done. We want to thank everybody for your involvement, and in a particular way, I want to state publicly in this forum how much I admire the work not only of this mayor, former mayor, but our current mayor in making the investments through Event DC and emphasizing so much the importance of Washington as a place where people live. It's not just politics. I grew up in Petworth. Trust me, it's not just politics. And to be able to have that emerge, particularly given what you're doing with the walkabouts. I advise, and a lot of people come to Washington real quick. A lot of people come to DC, right? And they think they know DC. I was like, baby, you don't know DC. Yeah, so it's like you need to walk the neighborhoods. You need to go talk to the people. You need to learn what that history really says about the direction of the country. So thank you for sharing in all of that. Mayor, final word to you.
No. I just want to also join with Michael in thanking everybody. And we are especially grateful to Mount Vernon, the Ladies Association of Mount Vernon. We are very proud to celebrate this moment about the history of Washington, D.C. here, because without a doubt, there would not be a Washington, D.C. were it not for George Washington. And even his death probably ushered in the resolve to complete the task that they'd been on, as you stated, Fergus. I'm just repeating what you taught me. That's when they said, look, we've got to close ranks and make it happen. Because as usual, Congress came up with an idea with no money.
That's so true.
So thank you all.
And thank our panel very, very much. Really appreciate all of you.